Good morning, everyone. My name is Neil Parekh, and I am guest hosting today's edition of Shree's New York Times Read Along. It is my pleasure to be here today, as always. Sometimes I'm in front of the camera, so to speak. Usually I am producing the show. I'm the executive producer and managing StreamYard, the new app that we're using to bring this show to you live on Facebook and LinkedIn. We have a great team of folks who help produce the show, and Paula Kiger and Steve Taylor from Philadelphia. Steve, sorry for the momentary pause. But I want to first acknowledge folks that are coming in that are joining us. We have Jonathan Borstein joining from the East Village. Hey, Jonathan, how are you doing? We have Beth Granger joining us. Beth does a lot of live shows on LinkedIn, so you should definitely check her out. And Beth, I can't remember where you live, so let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We have Bob Veritoni from New Milford, New Jersey, and Diane Stefani as well. She's watching on a Greyhound bus to New York, and always looks forward to the show. Thank you for your support, Diane. We would encourage everyone to share the show. Let us know where you're watching from, and make sure to share this live stream. Mention your friends, other people you think might be interested in watching. Takes just a quick moment on Facebook. We're going to do that ourselves. And I'd encourage our guest. I know Walter Greason is ready and waiting. But while we're waiting to bring you on, Walter, go ahead and share this on Facebook. Find the LinkedIn post as well. I'm going to do the same. I have my tablet here, ready to do that. One of the things that we've learned just in terms of managing a StreamYard, and one of the things that we try to show is that we. It's challenging to run StreamYard and a Facebook Live in the same window. So we encourage, for us at least, you need to go to a different device to make that happen. So I'm just going to take a moment and see whether I can share this real quick, and we'll get back to. Let's see. Here we go. Share, and. There we go. So that's shared on Facebook. I'll see if I can get LinkedIn as well. We'll go back to some of the comments, some of the people who are joining us today. We have Mary Sikorsky from New York City. Beth Granger is in Port Washington in New York. Thank you, Beth. And our friend Jonathan is recovering from the Outsider Art Show, which included artists from India for the first time. So that's cool. Mark Lee is joining us from Durham, North Carolina. Thank you, Mark, as always. Always appreciate you joining the show. Our friend Sunny Slaughter is joining us. Sunny was a guest back in August when we did a special edition of the New York Times Read Along focused on the 1619 Project. And that's actually when I first started interacting with our guest today, Walter Greason from Monmouth University. So again, Sunny, thank you so much for joining us, for being part of our New York Times Read Along family. And what a great show we had talking about the 1619 Project. Shafali Patel is joining us. Hi, Shafali. Diana is joining us from San Francisco. We do have people who wake up early, 5:30 a.m. Pacific time to join the show, which is incredible. One of our producers, Paula Kiger, is based in Tallahassee, Florida, and Ron Thomas is joining us from Saudi Arabia today. Ron was our guest a few weeks ago and is an HR professional and strategist. Thank you so much, Ron, for all of the work that you do. We'll keep some of the introductions coming. Navadita is joining us from Kanpur, truly an international audience. We have Deborah Kerr from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. As I mentioned earlier, we have a great production team. Paula Kiger is managing things on Facebook, and Steve Taylor is managing things on LinkedIn. You can find their social handles right at the bottom of the screen in just a moment. Please make sure to connect with them as well. And if you're watching on LinkedIn, just know that Steve Taylor is going to be sharing your comments with us manually. We have a back channel for that. StreamYard and LinkedIn haven't figured out how to make the feed work just yet. So we will catch your comments and answer them as best as possible during the show. But you can follow Paula Kiger at Big Green Pen on all channels, all social channels, and Steve Taylor is at Steve DERIV. Steve, correct? Tell me, is there an E at the end of that? Did I miss the E? So let me fix that real quick. And that's one of the things I like about StreamYard is that we can make changes on the fly and just add the E to make it correct. So Steve derive, depending on how you depending on how you pronounce that. Of course, I'm the guest host and executive producer, and you can find me at Neil Parekh on all channels of Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as well. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is thank everyone for joining us and have Walter Greason join us on the show. He's ready and waiting. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll have Walter join us. Split screen. Walter, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. Appreciate you joining us on a Sunday morning. If you weren't joining us Sunday morning, what do you usually do on Sundays, Walter?
My goodness, the variety. Mostly, I'd say 70% getting ready for church or religious ceremony. The others are then tied into activism, doing a lot of community service work. So doing my best to wake up, be of service, stay connected to my faith.
Well, that's great. Thank you for that. Thank you for giving us your Sunday morning. Just for a little bit of background for folks, you're a professor at Monmouth University, right?
I am.
Historian, educator, futurist. Tell us a little bit about your background and your work.
So yes, Monmouth University is an extraordinary place. I've worked in history, economic history specifically, their honors education, their honors school. I was dean for a couple of years, and now I am overseeing graduate programs in education for master's degrees for principals and supervisors, superintendents, and we have a brand new doctorate in educational leadership. That's a spectacular program. So that's the core of my responsibilities in terms of my research. Afrofuturism, dealing with how African-American history shapes world history. And of course, this piece that comes out of 1619 is the role of slavery in creating the modern kind of commercial system. And so that is the heart of a lot of my work. And then I tie it into education by looking at schools and school systems as part of the larger economy around the world.
Absolutely. And we're going to cover a lot of those issues. Definitely, we're going to talk about the 1619 project. We're going to talk about MLK Day, of course, and Dr. King's legacy today. We'll talk about Black Panther, incredible movie, and some of your work around Afrofuturism. And there's several articles in the paper we'll also get to, which I think is going to be good. I want to, Sunny Slaughter is giving you a good morning, Dr. Greason. I know she's a big fan. Other folks that have joined us, Rui Rosario from Portugal, Girish Kumar is saying hi, and our friend Rose Horowitz is joining from Milford, Connecticut. So we certainly have a good group here, and Steve will let us know some of the folks who are joining from on LinkedIn. We have Walter's social channels at the bottom of the screen. You'll find him on Facebook, on Twitter at World Professor, and on LinkedIn at Wealth Builder 2050 is the moniker there. tell us a little bit about Wealth Builder 2050. What was your what's the branding behind that?
So it was around the time that I came to Monmouth, I want to say 6 or 7 years ago, that I kind of built the LinkedIn account. And when I talk about Wealth Builder, it's really getting people to understand concepts of cultural and social capital, how macroeconomists look at the way our nations and our communities function together. And so that was really important for me to start to look at the core of what I do in economic history is explain to working people how the circumstances around them evolve, how they can take advantage of opportunities or avoid really punitive kinds of negative events that'll come and lead to unemployment, lead to contracting income. So creating ladders of opportunity is really what a lot of my work on LinkedIn is about. How do people find the best way to make the most money in the least amount of time?
And we have a question from Mark Lee from Facebook asking if you know a Daryl Stover, an Afrofuturist at NC State.
I know the name, but I don't think I've met him personally.
Great, great. And I should remind folks, and Beth, you wanted to make sure that we were sure about this. Excuse me. First of all, she's mentioning adding someone to her production team. She does, like I said, a lot of LinkedIn Live presentations. But the comments, the reason we can't get the comments from LinkedIn directly is because the API isn't open technically between LinkedIn and StreamYard. So that's why we do a workaround. And Beth, thank you for making sure that we were clear about that. We do have several people joining us from LinkedIn from Singapore, New York City, Mississauga, and from Mississauga, Ontario. So that's always great. Steve, thank you for the update on that. We're going to go ahead and start our conversation. So before we jump into the paper, I want to ask Walter if you can talk a little bit about Dr. King's legacy. We're going now, almost 50 plus years since his assassination. There's a really great article in the Sunday Review that we'll get to, but talk about Dr. King's legacy in 2020.
So there's so much to unpack there at the heart of it. I would say we don't fully appreciate the transformation of the world we live in due to his influence. At the heart, the inflexibility of legal Jim Crow in kind of assigning people what their lives would be like forever, based on their physical appearance, based on their religious background. We live in a world that over the last 50 years has transformed so thoroughly in that what we accomplish, what we earn, actually does have a much greater impact on the type of life we live. And so that the dream about being judged by the content of your character has made enormous leaps forward. It's just if you were to look at the world prior to the Montgomery bus boycott and then look around and see what we see today, you'd think you were in different dimensions. It's almost impossible to imagine from the mid 20th century to imagine how far we've come. At the same time, and this is where we get into trouble, we completely underestimate the ways that white supremacy has adapted and evolved and kind of maintained rigid systems of inequality. It's particularly segregation is where I focus most of my work on. And I'm most happy that on social media, when I came in 2012, almost no one talked about segregation as this kind of ongoing pernicious feature of American and world society. And now there's just thousands of conversations and resources that show us this. And so we underestimate King's impact in making our lives better and making more things possible, but we have absolutely no comprehension of how difficult the systems of restrictions and limitations and inequity, how pernicious and resilient those are, and what's really necessary to undo them and achieve the dream that Martin had.
Well, let's jump into the paper for a second, and we're going to do things a little bit differently today, particularly because of the topic and this really great article in the Sunday Review this cover story. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this story and switch to my cell phone so that we can show the paper. So we'll take 1 second on that. Now you can hear me, correct?
Yes.
And I'll take off the speaker. There we go. So the Sunday Review section has a great story, very timely, and this image is actually by Yoongi Kim, who is a friend, I think middle school friend of Beth Granger's. But it's a very striking photo, and I believe it was from one of the rallies. When I saw a caption, I think this might be from Ferguson, if I'm not mistaken. But if you look at the article, "Injustice on Repeat. From mass incarceration to mass deportation, our nation remains in deep denial." The article is by Michelle Alexander. 10 years have passed since my book, The New Jim Crow, was published. I wrote it to challenge our nation to reckon with the recurring cycles of racial reform, retrenchment, and rebirth of caste-like systems that have defined our racial history since slavery. It has been an astonishing decade. Everything and nothing has changed. I want to repeat that. Everything and nothing has changed, which is certainly very, very telling and very poignant. And, oh, sorry about that. I had the speaker off. Somehow it popped back on. So hopefully the audio should be good again, Walter. And
yes. No, this
right?
this article
Give me a
is
thumbs up.
yes. Gotcha.
I can see you on screen. Great. And I'll put my headphones in so that I can hear too. In the story, if you jump to page 6, to me, this tells the whole story right here. So let's go right to it. Always tricky turning the pages and holding a phone, but So first of all, I want to just point out the layout that they do, right? The centerfold, text down the middle, and very prominent photos down both outside columns, which I think is really great. We have protesters in Ferguson, so hopefully you can see that. Parents and their children at a 2018 sit-in in Washington. Police officers firing tear gas in Ferguson. President Obama speaking in Baltimore, Maryland. That's probably after I'll call it the murder of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, when he was in the back of a police van. A group of migrants walking along the Mexican side of the border in June. Protesters in Baltimore, again, after the aftermath of Freddie Gray's death in 2015. So I guess the Baltimore President Obama thing would have been earlier than that. President Trump in January. Brothers, ages 4 and 3, from El Salvador at a border patrol station. White supremacists march across the campus of the University of Virginia, and that may have been around, that looks like it's the Charlottesville rally from, I think, 2 years ago. A chalk outline at a rally to protest the acquittal of George Zimmerman, of course, the person who shot Trayvon Martin. Some of the pull quotes: "We are now living in an era of unabashed racialism. The politics of white supremacy resurface again and again." This is the world we're living in currently, Walter.
Yes.
Appreciate your sense of how far we've come since Dr. King, and how far we still have to go. How do you not get depressed looking at this? How do you, and even more poignantly, if you've been to DC and the Museum of African American History and Culture, how do you walk through, particularly those bottom floors, focusing on slavery and the history of Jim Crow? How do you walk out of that not angry every day?
Well, you remind me of John Hope Franklin. Really,
Yes.
one of the leaders, titans of American history. Um, carrying the anger is real. James Baldwin talks about the anger of being African American in this country, and that's I can't deny that. There were days over the last 3 decades. I think back to working with organizations in community in New York when Abner Louima was attacked, Amadou Diallo was shot, and yeah, the anger is profound. At the same time, Dr. King gives us a path towards faith, to channel anger, to the the pain and the rage, finding a way to express that creatively so that it becomes a cause for hope and for love and for justice. Um, Vengeance is seductive, there's no doubt. And so finding ways where we bring our anger to the fore so that our children and our grandchildren have a better world to live in, that in the next year we see some progress in some community, that there are breakthroughs that carry us forward. I think a lot about the passing of Toni Morrison last year and the way that she took all of the pain and anger that she felt and turned it into literature that absolutely transformed literature and American English, made it possible for us to feel across some of these really divisive boundaries, and really brought Black women's history and perspective to the fore in a way that hadn't been done. Next week, a new graphic novel is coming out about Octavia Butler, who did very similar work. Her Parable of the Sutton Sower book with John Jennings and Damian Duffy. That book is all about the moment we're in, when community is collapsing, when trauma surrounds us. How do we find a way to build something new and maintain our dignity? The stories are here. We have them. People like me and the community of activists and scholars that I belong to, we live that every day. And we have to find moments like this one, like this morning, to encourage people to join us in moving towards love and hope and to embrace peace, not war.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. And it certainly is a struggle that folks encounter every day. Several great comments coming in on Facebook in particular, pausing on Sunny Slaughter's, yes, a cause for hope and justice. And she had also made reference to the fact that she has done work on mass incarceration, led a panel discussion for the state of Black health in Louisiana last year. So let's talk about incarceration and the justice system. Again, we will get back to the front page, but there's some specific articles I want to call out for folks and lead this discussion. I was interested just in terms of looking at the layout and cover story. The New York Times Magazine cover story is about Rudy Giuliani, which I think is a whole different question, a whole different issue to discuss. Did he change, or did America? That's a lot of the politics and the President Trump stuff. What looks like the dominant story when you look online is previewed on page 3, and the picture is of Reginald Adams, who was exonerated in 2014 after serving nearly 34 years in prison for murder. It's a whole story about split juries, and so I want to get to that to see what it looks like in the magazine itself. So here's a great shot. This is the photographs by Larry Fink, the story by Emily Bazelon, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. This is a picture of Michael Shannon, who was wrongfully convicted of murder, even though 2 jurors voted to acquit him. Shadow of a Doubt is the article. They actually, the jury decision was 10-2 when they did the first vote, when they went in the jury room. And that was enough to put him away. And if you look through the article, they actually did portraits of several people who were convicted, both in terms of a write-up and pictures of the individual with someone from the jury that served on their jury. So again, the power of photography, and I looked at this online. I certainly think it's more powerful in print. And that's one of the reasons we do the New York Times read along every week at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time. It's a celebration of the New York Times, but specifically of print journalism. There's so much more you get often. Certainly, there's more you can put online in terms of video, in terms of annotating transcripts, as we'll see with the New York Times endorsement process. But some of these photographs just jump out at you. And what I want to point to is this whole issue of split juries. Why they even exist as a legacy of slavery and the racism. But it's not just around slavery, and it wasn't just a tactic used against blacks. There are only two states in the country that use split juries. Oregon is one, and Louisiana is the other. In Louisiana, it was, they literally started with, this was after Reconstruction when blacks started serving on juries. They took a census. What's the percentage of blacks in that state? What's the likely number of black jurors on a jury if things were equal? And they figured, then we might have 2 or 3 black jurors. So let's change the numbers and make it, you need 9 to convict, right? Completely disenfranchising, any potential votes from a black juror. The same thing happened in Oregon, but the not so much with blacks, but with Jews. Anti-Semitism. Someone was acquitted of a case, and the concern was that there were too many Jews, too many Eastern European immigrants, so they changed the rules to lower the number of jurors. Walter, what are your thoughts on this? What are your reflections on that?
So one of the stereotypes that gets reinforced is that somehow a place like Oregon is fundamentally different from a place like Louisiana. One of the most pernicious ideas is that the South, or the Deep South, fundamentally was more racist than New Jersey or Ohio or Illinois. And it's completely false. Just when you start to look beyond just the history of slavery specifically, although if you look far enough back in the history of slavery, you get to the same kind of conclusion. But this kind of white supremacy, this way that people find enormously creative and inventive ways to maintain separation and injustice against religious minorities, against African Americans, against American Indians. These systems go back hundreds of years, and as they're challenged or legal restrictions are placed on them, they adapt. And so you look at the film Just Mercy, you look at stories like this one in the magazine, and you see that people are fundamentally dedicated to maintaining white authority, and the ways that can be challenged. I think one of my colleagues at Johns Hopkins University's Nathan Connolly spoke recently about Barack Obama integrating or desegregating the White House. That moment was a call for new white backlash against any attempt to make a society equal for all people. And so we see this manifest in the 2016 election and so many of the events that have transpired in the last 2 or 3 years. So that fundamental commitment is a national commitment. And I'd say really this morning, it's an international commitment. As I've looked around the world and been to New Zealand and worked with people in China and talked to folks in all parts of Europe and even on the African continent, frankly, there's a commitment to saying people are fundamentally different, and that ultimately anything that maintains broadly white or European or Christian hegemony, dominance, that's going to be a priority to maintain. And that's where we see so much of the kind of back and forth around the way Vladimir Putin's activities have reshaped global politics in the last 3 years, is that there's this deeply ethnocentric sense of it, and that order is a way to both destabilize a power for democratic inclusion, as the United States aspires to be, but this vision of Dr. King is a fundamental threat to that sense of division and chaos and violence.
Thank you. And just a quick audio. We're good, Steve and Walter? Great.
I hear you.
Just want to make sure when we switch back and forth between the phone and the computer, there's some really great comments coming in. Sunny is saying I need to get a print copy of this because the photography is stunning, which is one of the things that we like to see with the read along. And we had a colleague of yours join. I want to go back, Kurt Wagner. Grateful to call Dr. Greason a colleague and have his inspiration regularly. Kurt, we can be jealous of you. You get his inspiration regularly. We are blessed to have his inspiration this morning. But for folks who are interested in following more of Dr. Greason's work and learning from him on a daily basis, certainly follow him on social media. His Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn handles are scrolling at the bottom of the screen. And again, I just want to thank you, Walter, from our interactions around the 1619 project, and then following the work that you've been doing since then. It really is. It's one of those things where I really appreciate seeing the work that you're doing. Some of the really what I think is groundbreaking work. One of the things I want to ask you about is the work around Black Panther and your Afrofuturism work. I'm going to go ahead and show a quick video interview that you did with Monmouth University. So we'll tee that up, and I'll take the comment off the screen for a moment and see if we can make this work. Let's see here.
So yeah, that first story in the Fantastic Four, so it's in that universe that the Black Panther is introduced. So there's this basic sense of science and this sense of the cosmic that's always being played out through Fantastic Four stories. And so it's there that you get the introduction to the nation of Wakanda as this isolated country that's amazingly technologically advanced, that's been hidden from the world forever. And frankly, Wakanda is constantly being drawn, and in the newest book I have, Cities Imagined, presented as a kind of utopia where nature and industry exist in balance. Because they never had the kinds of wars and strife that characterized humanity for the last 1,000 years, they advanced much more rapidly and built a much more cohesive culture. We see a difference between, say, Thor Ragnarok and the Thor series of Marvel movies and the Lord of the Rings series, where there are people of different ethnicities and backgrounds that are all part of kind of fantasy past or the impossible future. Afrofuturism lets us take music and movies and comics, novels, and leverage all of it to say that we can have a world where the limitations and boundaries that we know don't have to exist. That process for African Americans to articulate a cultural and political agenda that gives them dignity is what you're seeing made manifest in the Black Panther movie, and the response of families and young people, that there are commercials and toys and media experiences that say you're a human being, you have great worth, you can be a genius, you can excel in multiple areas. It is a radical act to showcase the dreams of the African diaspora, that the way the future of humanity as a species, as we transcend our limitations as a species and live on other planets and move to new places and break through dimensional barriers. That's what Afrofuturism really is how do you take the Black aesthetic and reimagine it in an infinite number of ways and contexts that liberate all of humanity from being trapped in the kind of modern paradigms, the ways that everyone is beholden to their religion or their language or their nation. That's the skill that I'm hoping will become more apparent, that more people will be able to decode the kinds of Black aesthetics that have accumulated in the last century as they watch the Black Panther film, but that they'll leave it and then be able to create their own new forms of expression
That was a great video, Walter, and great interview. Thank you again, Monmouth University, where you are based, for producing that video and letting us show that. When did you start working on preparing for the release of Black Panther?
Ooh, there were conversations as far back as 2007, where I believe it was around that time that Reginald Hudlin, a filmmaker, done extraordinary work back through the 80s and 90s. I guess most recently really famous for producing the Academy Awards and for working as a producer on Django Unchained. Reginald Hudlin hosted conversations about his writing and the production of Marvel Comics' Black Panther as a comic book. And so around 2007 is where I started mapping out if there was going to be a feature production about that story, how would it be done? What elements needed to be emphasized? So
2007.
Yeah, so the film
And it
comes
came out
out in
when?
2018, so about 11 years of conversations. The really intense stuff for me about audience engagement and getting people prepared to understand what was possible with that film came out of once the Marvel Cinematic Universe really became the phenomenon it did, and the Captain America Winter Soldier movie did well, that introduced the Black Panther character. Then I focused for really 2 years, very intensely every day, putting out content related to Afrofuturism. And I think the main article was with the African American Intellectual History Society, called The Introduction to the Wakanda Syllabus, where I provided a multimedia bibliography of a range of works related to the emergence of Afrofuturism, so that people could read as much or as little as they wanted about all the people who produced the kinds of symbols and ideas that would actually inform the movie when it came about. And so those conversations were really important. And as we got into late 2017, and I knew the Cities Imagined had gone off to press, and I wanted to talk about the history of Black towns and cities that really had been widely ignored. Doing that work to make people more aware of independent Black communities and the visions of alternatives to what we understood as modern society today that we could access, that were readily available to us, that's when I knew Black Panther was an entry point, and that as great as the film might be, and even a week beforehand, those of us who were sitting at the Schomburg Center and doing Black Comic Book Weekend, we were all debating, just how big would the film be? And we had seen the pre-orders. We knew folks in Black communities were very excited. But as we saw it take off in the month of February, we knew that really the industry had a chance, film as an industry had a chance to undo the damage that started with a film like Birth of a Nation back in 1915, is to undo white supremacy as a core aesthetic of film and television. And thankfully, we're seeing signs of that. I mean, if you look at the recent Watchmen production by HBO, you're seeing ways that the African diaspora's imagination comes into play. And I know there are more projects in production. Jordan Peele's success is another sign of this. But there are literally thousands of writers and artists out around the world that are making it possible for us to have a much wider range of expression in world culture. And so that's been my joy with the Black Panther project, was specifically the film is spectacular. It is one of the most important films ever made in cinema. And going to challenge some of the folks who say that Marvel movies have little depth, that they don't really move audiences profoundly. These folks, and then the work that I see every day, Afrofuturism is making it possible for us to see that white supremacy is not a given or natural, that in fact it's a distortion. It's a way that we limit each other and cause each other pain and suffering that must not continue. And so it's a concrete way to bring new people to Dr. King's mission, but also opens a door for new people to step up and take the forefront and say, we have a better world that we can build right now. And so that's what my 2020 is really dedicated to, is emphasizing places. Like in a couple of weeks, I'll be in Eatonville, Florida for the Zora Neale Hurston Festival. This is an independent Black community in Florida dedicated to creating exactly what we imagine in Wakanda. But this was happening in 1890. This is 130 years ago, people were doing this work. And there are so many places. The Historic Black Towns Alliance across the Gulf Coast is doing this work. And now I've seen people out in the Plain States preserving historic Black places so people can come and live this life and see they have better societies where this kind of development is inclusive. So I'm living in a moment where it's beyond just the success of the Black Panther movie or the idea of Afrofuturism. It's the literal lived reality. I guess I have to say at the heart of it, I'm located at Monmouth University in central New Jersey, and there's a set of places called the Black Brain Belt. And the Black Brain Belt centered on 3 towns, Red Bank, Long Branch, and Asbury Park, where African-American scientists and technicians and engineers all gathered between 1945 and 1995 and really pioneered a lot of the technologies that we're using right now for this conversation, being able to bounce radio waves off the moon or create satellite communications more broadly, using microwaves to actually help enable wireless communication. All of this is happening with these Black technicians and engineers in ways that are within my lifetime. Like many of these men I still talk to and work with every day, but there's no concept or discussion of their important contributions. And so people think Wakanda is fantastic, and just that's impossible. There could never be. And in fact, my entire life is defined by those realities. And so that is maybe the most important thing I can contribute today is, as you think about Afrofuturism, it's not just fiction and literature and film. It's also the very real history that we have not taught and communicated to people. It's about the policies we can enact that actually make for a stronger nation and a stronger world.
And as you were talking, I had your page up from Monmouth University showing the links to the Wakanda syllabus and other resources. I know that Steve and Paula were sharing it through Facebook and LinkedIn as well. Our friend Chitachi Egwu from Atlanta has another recommendation. Dr. Ronaldo Anderson from Harris Stowe University.
Yes.
Active on Afrofuturism.
He's outstanding. One of the lead theorists, in my view. He has done outstanding work. I met him and Yatasha Womack, who's also written extensively on foundations of Afrofuturism. Another name I'll put in that list, 2 other names, Julian Chambliss at Michigan State and Sheena Howard at Rider University. They're doing extraordinary work to help us kind of build out this vision that I've been describing this morning. Out at Purdue, there's a whole Black Digital Humanities Initiative that is, for the next decade, going to make it possible for us to know and learn more about these places where white supremacy does not prevail.
I wanted to also flag a question from our friend Diana Rahini from San Francisco. She woke up early for this, but she has a really good question. This whole issue of Halloween costumes, if you will, or other for dress up day. Her daughter, who is a mixed race child, wanting to dress up as Shuri from Black Panther. And any thoughts on what is or not okay in this regard?
My goodness, children exploring and fantasizing about who they are and what it means is extraordinary. A lot of these issues about cultural appropriation are having to do with roots of minstrelsy in American culture. That is, do people put on blackface and kind of exaggerate their features to ridicule or demean people of different ethnicities? And that's not what Diana's daughter is doing at all. She's expressing kind of admiration and respect and inspiration to achieve new heights because of the way she connected with the characters in the story. And so whenever anybody has a question about any of that, please bring it right to me. One of my first lessons as a college professor were students taking a civil rights course, but who resented the content so much that they went out and threw a blackface party and they excluded all the Black students in the class from attending the party. And clearly, that kind of small, petty gesture goes on all the time. There are ways to strike back at people of color, particularly people who are Black and Indigenous, to attempt to remind them and reimpose on them that they should be ashamed somehow, or they should be demeaned, or they should know their place. That kind of stuff goes on and on and on. That's not at all. That's the opposite of what people embracing Black Panther is about.
And getting back to the conversation of Jim Crow and the current state of race relations, we have a comment from a David Greason, who I believe you know, that Florida is reenacting the poll tax this very past week. Walter, before you comment on that, David Greason is?
That's my dad. That's my dad. It's
Hey,
the
Dad.
reason I am who I am.
Thank you for watching and joining us and supporting the great work that your son is doing. Walter, poll taxes, just another example of what's going on?
So the way my career's evolved, I don't teach civil rights as much as I used to. So more of my work is now about school systems and districts and laws and policies. When I was doing that work all the time, one of the key lessons early in the course was talking about legal restrictions on citizenship that emerged under the Black codes and under the Jim Crow laws in the second half of the 19th century. And so what my father is talking about there with the poll tax are ways that people were charged money before they were allowed to vote. And so this idea is extraordinarily seductive. It took an amendment to the Constitution to say that this was illegal. It's paired with two other kinds of restrictions, grandfather clauses, saying essentially if your grandfather couldn't vote, you can't vote. And so this perpetually across time maintains a second-class citizenship for people who are excluded. Another is literacy tests, and literacy tests varied widely in terms of you could ask someone you wanted to vote a very simple question like spell the word dog. But then if someone wanted to actually vote and you didn't want them to, you might say, well, translate this document from the ancient Aramaic. And these kinds of ways of, at the local site, preventing people who disagreed with you from voting were pervasive through the Jim Crow era. And so this whole notion of poll taxes coming back it's again the resilience that we point to in the magazine, that where Michelle Alexander is talking about the reinvention of racial exclusion. People can find an infinite number of ways to maintain a racially apartheid state until they're forced to say, no, we will sanction you. And at the heart of all of this is really the Supreme Court's decision to hamstring the Voting Rights Act. And so in undermining federal oversight of these states and the ways that they work to exclude people, the last 10 years have seen this massive expansion of these different restrictions, not just poll taxes, but purging voters from rolls. Most notably comes to mind for me in Georgia, that saying that the right to vote is limited and only people who are responsible or trustworthy or conservative can be trusted to vote. These things destroy the foundation of our society, and we worked for a long time to get past them. And until we stand up and really call them out and organize against them, they're going to continue to grow.
So following up on your father's comment, I want to just give a quick shout out to my mom, who is one of our loyal watchers. She's actually in India for several months, but she's still logging in from there. Hi, Mom. Thank you for joining. And I know that our neighbor, Rochelle from Hastings-on-Hudson, is watching as well, so thank you. I do want to, Diana offered a big thank you for your comments, that it was her instinct and that's what she went with. But it's always helpful to have that answer when you're looking at questions like that. So I do want to make sure that we get back to the paper a little bit.
Yes, indeed.
This is the New York Times read along. It would be fascinating to do a separate show just with you and cover all the work that you're doing. But let's go.
There's so much pressing.
What's that?
There's so many pressing issues. Yeah, we definitely need to stay focused on today.
There are pressing issues and a range of different things. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back to my camera. So hopefully you can hear me again, and the audio is good.
Yes.
Good, good. It's just a question of that transition. So let's take a look at the front page real quick, which is probably the latest we've ever gotten to the front page at 9:21. But this has been a fascinating discussion so far. Now, what's interesting, I shared an early edition of the front page yesterday afternoon on Twitter, but things change with the news, even much less online, but even with the print edition. Trump's lawyers, this is the lead story, is always the top right corner of the paper. So if you could see that, Trump's lawyers dismissed charges as brazen plot. That's their response to the impeachment charges that were formally filed in the Senate. The display story, so the dominant story on the page, a picture of Ariel McCullough is one of the banners in Seeing Newman, an art installation that upended the Georgia community. Art forces a small southern city to rethink its image. If we were, had any illusions that race was not front and center, it certainly is, particularly in the South. It was a Saturday afternoon that the small southern city had been dreading. A group of neo-Nazis promised to hold a rally in downtown Newman to celebrate Adolf Hitler's birthday and rail against illegal immigration and the removal of Confederate monuments. Certainly, a banner like this, a year after the white nationalist rally, the town made an effort to address this by putting up 17 large-scale banner portraits, images of the ordinary people who make up Newman. They hang from the porches of brick buildings around downtown. There's Helen Berry, an African-American woman who for years worked at a sewing factory. Wiley Driver, a white worker who folded and packed blankets. A waitress who arrived in Newman carrying her Mexican traditions. Fighting back with art, which is an interesting concept. Another important story, and by Kashmir Hill, face scan app inches toward end of privacy using 3 billion photos to identify anyone. There are certainly concerns around privacy with facial recognition and apps. I will say that the Google Photos I've seen it be stronger than Facebook in terms of facial recognition. What's interesting when you're doing Facebook Live, not through StreamYard, the way that we're doing it now, but if you're using your phone, it will automatically recognize whoever's in the shot and ask the person, do you want to tag them? I see Walter Greason. Do you want to tag them in your video? But that being said, Google Photos, it does have it's a valuable tool when you're looking at thousands of photos that you've uploaded to try and collect all of the photos of one person, of my daughter, of friends of the family, to be able to share an album with them, or even for my wife and I to share albums with each other from our phones. When she takes a picture of Emily, I automatically get a notification that this has been added to an album. So there are some concerns with privacy, certainly. There are also some ways that we can use it, hopefully, for good. Other stories on the front page, the Meghan Markle and Prince Harry are in the news in terms of their splitting from the royal family, finding freedom in a Syria of ever fewer men, and up for the 5th Senate term, Susan Collins walks the impeachment tightrope. When you turn inside, one of the things that we like to focus on is page 2 and page 3. On page 3 at the very top, you see the of interest section, which is a little hard to see. Hopefully you can see it on your screens. This is not available in print, online rather, but it's almost like a guide to this Sunday's edition. There's a piece in the magazine, law enforcement agencies without an agility test have 45% more sworn women officers, according to a survey from the National Center for Women and Policing in the magazine. A very simple statement: Quebec is Canada's largest province. I'm sure they could have said more about Quebec than just that in the teaser. There's a piece about AT&T in the book review. England is the birthplace for the modern jury. The need for unanimous verdicts was established there in 1367. That's from the story that we started with on split juries. There's an article about Dog the Bounty Hunter. And in 2016, the United States ranked 43rd in the world for life expectancy. That's from the Book Review. And there are at least 45 intimacy coordinators, professional facilitators. This is not appropriate, not safe for work, but this is in the New York Times. There are at least 45 intimacy coordinators, professional facilitators of simulated sex and nudity in theater and film, now working across the United States, Canada, and Britain. There's an article called The Sex Choreographer in the magazine. You never know what you're going to get when you start reading, right? One article that I'm going to spend some time with and focus on is the endorsement of the New York Times in the Democratic primaries. This Inside the Times article on page 2, which is available online, is talking about the Weekly, which is their weekly TV show, and the endorsement. And what's fascinating is that, and I'm going to turn the video around real quick. Oops, I'm going to flip this around. Sorry about that. What I think is fascinating is that for the endorsement process, the Times has always done an extensive process of interviewing candidates, but for the first time this year, they're putting all of the transcripts online. Came out with a special section with excerpts of the interviews in today's paper, which we'll get to in a moment. And they're going to show, they have their weekly TV show. They're going to announce their endorsement at the end of tonight's show, which I believe is either at 9 or 10 p.m. on FX. So I thought that's just fascinating in terms of the use of multimedia. We talk about how the New York Times read along is a celebration of print, but it's also an acknowledgement of what you can do online, what you can show in terms of putting full transcripts, video, and then this TV show that they have too, to put the endorsement at the end of the TV show. Talk about must-see TV. That is really an interesting approach. So as far as the rest of the paper is concerned, let's take a look at what else is in the front page, and then we'll get back to our guest, Walter Greason. We mentioned the Prince Harry and Meghan Markle story. Here is a good full-page ad, and I always like focusing on the ads because you don't see that online in the same way. A full page from the ACLU. We the people means all of us. 100 years ago today, a small group of determined activists formed what became the ACLU. So that's an interesting promo. Here's an article about China, scared but resilient. Uyghur town clings to its cultural past. So what else do we have here? Australia tries to adjust to status as a recipient of charity, not a donor, with the wildfires there. That's just been an incredible comment on climate change, but also very devastating both to individuals and animals. I know that there were several pictures that have been shared online. Stories about Ukraine, about Syria. And then we get to the U.S. section. Here's an interesting piece about U.S. politics, a thornier path in politics for women of Buttigieg's age. So the question of what a small town mayor, 37 years old, if I'm not mistaken, 38, I think just the other day, if that was the profile of a woman, would she be contending for the Democratic nomination in the same way that he is? So they have interviews with several women in politics of the same age. More on impeachment. And here's that facial recognition story. Again, to take a look at the layout and the prominence given to the story, 2 pages inside. Interesting graphical treatment, if you can see that in the way they laid out the pictures. So that's always telling. And then here is the full page, again, another 2-page spread. Walter, this is the continuation of that story about art forcing a southern city to rethink its image. And this is where, I would definitely want to see this online. Here's one of the portraits. And if I can zoom in, you'll see there are two women wearing hijab, which is interesting. Another African American woman. Here's an older white man in the corner, and an older white woman. So it's not just people of color, but they are definitely using the imagery to send a message, which I think is really great. Here's some coverage of the women's marches, and it's interesting. I don't know if it shouldn't have been a timing thing, but I know that several years ago that was front page story and had a full page spread. Now it's on page 23. Some good photos and maybe more online, but doesn't look like the same coverage as before. So here is, I don't know, Walter, if you've been following news about the gun rights rally here in Virginia, in Richmond. No guns, no torches. Virginia applies the lessons from Charlottesville. The police, the governor declared a state of emergency. The police made several arrests ahead of the rally. Hopefully this addressed some of the concerns that happened the last time there was that major rally in Charlottesville. What are your thoughts on these types of rallies and the police response? Is it a question of sometimes the police can actually be proactive, the authorities can be proactive and keep things from getting out of hand, or are they more often than not part of the problem?
I don't think that's an either or. There are layers of real contradiction between kind of mob activity and then state law enforcement, either the way they apply different standards about who is to be kind of arrested for disorderly conduct and who is just kind of exercising free speech or freedom to assemble under the Constitution. And all of those things are deeply implicated with the nation's history of inequality based on race or ethnicity or religion. And so I'm glad to see Virginia being more active. All of these things carry echoes of really horrendous mob violence with participation from local law enforcement throughout American history. So whenever those gatherings happen, I do hold my breath and worry about the people who live locally and may be in danger on the occasions when these events take place. Whenever they disperse and go their own way, I'm able to breathe a little bit more easily. But the way to tie it to some of the stuff from the front page, surveillance isn't applied to white nationalists in the same way. Like many times it's folks who are on social media who are tracking down people who are violent at these neo-Nazi rallies and holding them accountable for their behavior when they attempt to just go back home and return to jobs or return to school. And that shouldn't be the case. When people are making active threats and organizing in support of things like what we saw with Dylan Roof in South Carolina, those are active terrorist cells. Those are people who mean to cause violence. And I spent my career living in places and working in places where people give hate an umbrella, give it a safe space to kind of flourish, and getting them to dismantle those kinds of protections when people are organizing active threats is very important. And I do wish that state police, local police, sheriff's offices would take hate violence directed against indigenous people, directed against Jewish communities, directed against African Americans and Latinos. I wish they would take these aspects more seriously. Even in social media, there are places where people organize on Facebook or on Twitter, and they say, oh, well, this is just, if I did that, I'd have to ban, 25% of the users. And it's not the impact of the ban. It's saying morally, you cannot target people and organize to do violence against people using these really powerful communications tools or under the protection of state and local law enforcement.
I can't remember the name of the movie. I think it was in the fall. It was on Amazon, if I'm not mistaken. It might have been in the theater. Adam Driver portrayed it. Do you remember the name of the movie, Walter?
Black Klansman? This is a Spike Lee
there,
movie?
there we go. This was years ago. So we saw it, I guess, on Amazon or Netflix more recently. But Black Klansman, correct? An example of infiltrating a white supremacist group back in the 60s. There's much more coverage, much more history around the FBI and law enforcement infiltrating groups like the Black Panthers or the NAACP, surveillance on Dr. King, et cetera. I think that even going to more recent times, the Black Lives Matter movement, the various groups associated with that, in some cases, portrayed as terrorist groups. I don't see the same level of surveillance or infiltration on the other side, if you will.
No, that case in that movie is something that was unique in a lot of ways, but an African-American law enforcement officer initiating contact with a white nationalist group.
Yeah.
And then his partner, colleague, actually embodying that and having to play the role and kind of be on the site in danger, and finding out what their activities were and preventing ongoing violence and terrorist organization. That is across history one of the most frustrating things, is the way that state actors, people who are given the public trust, believe that somehow community organizers trying to stand up for racial justice and inclusion are the real terrorists. It speaks to how much work we have to do to understand that our principles should not be bound by race, ethnicity, and religion, and language, nationality, that we all enjoy these protections or none of us do. Dr. King's quote about injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that I think a greater percentage of the American public takes that principle seriously now. I've seen enormous progress, but we're not the majority. There are still people who want to take it or leave it depending on their sense of who they're comfortable interacting with on a daily basis. And so trying to get us to the place where it's completely unacceptable for anyone to tolerate white nationalism or anti-Semitism, violence against Hispanic or Latino migrants, that's a long road, and we're not close to the end of it yet.
I want to make sure that we get this question that came in from LinkedIn from Sachin Bhargava. How to empower countries like Rwanda, Kenya, Nigeria, and other African countries? That's a broad question. It's certainly not an easy answer to that.
No, I mean, Rwanda's done some extraordinary work. Most people in the United States and maybe in English-speaking countries still associate Rwanda with the horrendous Hutu-Tutsi genocide, almost a generation ago now. But no, the formation of an African Union as a free trade zone, the adoption of numerous mobile technologies and digital currencies, moving them away from the echoes of colonialism that continue to survive today. I was encouraged recently that Haiti was invited to the African Union. Finding these kinds of transnational networks that enable these nations to create or develop greater economic autonomy, those are the keys. And so I've thought a lot recently about the comparative legacies of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe and Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And they're two really different portraits of the ways that the African continent is choosing to move forward. But I guess overall, in this kind of context for a New York Times read-along, looking at African independence and Caribbean economic development, those things are still very early in the process of creating stable, strong societies, especially in the context of climate change. And so we're probably 30 to 50 years from really seeing what the product of all the choices today, what fruit they'll bear. And it's the kind of work I hope to do more of going forward, is helping people on the continent and in the Caribbean, and even in parts of Southeast Asia through the South Asian subcontinent. How do we find models that are not predicated on the types of global trade that we've seen in the IMF and the World Bank, that it's not just kind of contingent on subsistence development and water systems and medical care that runs through international aid agencies. Allowing people to imagine, I guess that's where I close my Cities Imagined collection, is how do we see a world that allows for mobility and human dignity, stability, protection from violence, without buying into a world where Amazon essentially controls or oversees all of our transactions. I think we have a chance for a global New Deal, something that saved the United States in the 1930s and early 1940s. We're in a moment with good policymakers that we could see a real massive kind of improvement in the standard of living around the world if we have the will and the kind of patience to coordinate it over the long term.
And Chitachi was just echoing your comments about Rwanda, that they've been doing some great work there. Let's take a look at the special feature that the New York Times has on their endorsement process. So this is a special section that they printed. It's available online in terms of the individual interviews, but as I said, this is the first time, and they were describing as well, this is the first time they put all of the content online and printed this special feature. One of the pieces I shared on Twitter is about the editorial board. And here they're giving a little bit more background, who's actually on the editorial board for the Times. And on the web, you can have full bios for each of these individuals. Then they have all of excerpts of all the interviews. And actually in the print, they actually do have some of the annotation as well. This middle column is a blue font annotating the interviews, which I think is really interesting. That was obviously Bernie Sanders and Tom Steyer, Andrew Yang. So certainly a interesting approach and a keepsake if you're interested in digging into the candidates and the New York Times endorsement process. Again, as I mentioned earlier, they will be announcing their endorsement at the end of the Weekly, which is their TV show that they do on Sunday nights. Another interesting article in the Sunday Business is about Adam Mosseri, the head of Instagram. Instagram is removing the likes on individual posts to try and address some of the issues with social media and the sense of competition and having to keep up with people, which is an interesting approach. Their articles about college, must you say hello to your colleagues in the morning, some good pieces in the Sunday Business. I do want to get back to the Sunday Review, however. We covered in depth this story about injustice on repeat, but there's some other interesting stories as well. Several articles about China, including an opinion piece by Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, and a We Don't Understand China's Power by David Leonhardt. Here's another an interesting article by Joan Williams, a professor of law and director of the Center for Work-Life Law at the University of California, Hastings College of Law, arguing that the Equal Rights Amendment is not the answer. Virginia recently passed the Equal Rights Amendment, and there's a question of seeing whether that can be revived. And a piece about whether or not America is ready if we are going to have a war. Again, that injustice on repeat story. Let's see, what else do we have in here? A piece by Jessica Stern, My Time with Karadzic. And some letters. These are what they asked readers to pick a book that influenced how they think, act, or look at the world. And here are some of the answers that people had. The Color Purple, Catch-22, Atlas Shrugged. Walter, what can you tell us about books that have influenced you in over time, either early in your career, or what do you find particularly inspiring right now?
That's a particularly dangerous question for a scholar. We could go on for quite a bit longer talking about the books that I love and how many.
One or two, Professor
So
Greason.
the ones I've been talking about most recently are the Octavia Butler books. So in the context of Afrofuturism, so much of what I've done for the last couple of years is bringing people to see her vision of what was happening in our world and how prescient she had been. For a long time, her Patternist series was my favorite. And this is a story we're going to see brought to digital media in the next year or two, but about a West African woman with supernatural powers, basically immortal, and how her life shapes much of what happens in terms of the development of North America. That's an extraordinary story built on some of the ideas she did in the Kindred book. But for me, Octavia Butler's Parable series is something I return to again and again. Parable of the Sower, I read, and in just seeing the way people deal with community collapse. So much of what I write about is about small Black towns and how they are torn apart by large macroeconomic forces that people can't grapple with. But her second book, Parable of the Talents, which is really about competing ideological visions for a nation, those two tracks of how generations of people disagree over the way religion shapes society, how people can find freedom and ultimately seek freedom by escaping Earth, by going to settle on a new world. Those things in Parable of the Talents made that my favorite nonfiction book. There are several others I like a lot, but Parable of the Talents still stands head and shoulders above. And then in terms of nonfiction, the book I have enjoyed and used the most the last several years is Carl Nightingale's Segregation. It's just a spectacular comparative look at racial segregation in the modern world across multiple countries and empires, comparing systems and how they evolve in relationship to each other. So if folks have not seen Nightingale Segregation, it's essential to understand the world we live in now and how we can actually start to build something better for ourselves going forward.
I knew that was a dangerous question to ask you. I knew I could ask you without preparation what you might think in terms of inspiring books. I do want to add, I'd be remiss if I didn't note that you have several books out, two that were put out recently that certainly would be added to several lists. One is the Industrial Segregation, right? And then the other is Cities Imagined, right? You came prepared. Industrial Segregation and Cities Imagined as well, which is more focused on Afrofuturism. I won't have to show them on the screen then. So thank you for being prepared. And our friend Chitachi was also sharing something similar, just in terms of the rapper Akon is developing a city in Senegal based on his own cryptocurrency called Acoin. Do you know anything about that?
I had read the initial reports, and I think a number of people on the continent, not just Akon, are inspired by what's possible to try and mobilize people around the idea of Afrofuturism, or Nnedi Okorafor calls it the African futurism. How do people build a better, stronger, more sustainable society going forward? But that whole idea of us being able to create better communities is happening in many circles. Probably more noted than what Akon has done is LeBron James and what he's done in Cleveland, building a academy to kind of give students the chances that he didn't feel he had as he was growing up. But a lot of folks, I think of Warwick Dunn in the NFL. He's done so much with Habitat for Humanity, giving single parents a chance to get on their feet. There are lots of local activities, and it's why I love the center column piece from the Times this morning about the debate around community and moving away from an exclusive idea of who owns a place to an inclusive idea where people share and kind of appreciate each other's different backgrounds. That's what some of the best work the New York Times does.
Are you talking about the front page piece about art in
art in a small
Georgia?
southern city? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Spectacular.
Absolutely. I would want to make sure that we do a shout out for the travel section, particularly because of last week's show. It was our incredible honor to be in New York and to have the travel editor, Amy Vership, and last year's 2019 52 Places Traveler, Sebastian Modak, as our guest. They walked us through both. Sebastian talked about his experiences last year. He traveling the entire year. He hit all the 52 places on the list, and or actually, he hit 51 of the places on the list. He couldn't go to Iran because of political issues, and he stopped at home just twice during that year. And then Amy talked us through the 52 places list for 2020, which had just been released. So this week's travel issue. Section, some interesting articles, a tiny window into Beijing's gay art world. Again, something I wouldn't have even imagined. And that is something that we can get only through the Times. Here is a piece about Quebec, which was referenced on that in that front, the page 2 section. Some great photography here. And then a piece about retracing Jimi Hendrix's experience in London. Any fan of Jimi Hendrix would be interested in that. I'm looking to see whether they do have a 36 hours section for Buenos Aires, where they look at what can you cover, what can you go to if you just had a 36-hour visit to a city. But I don't see a 52 places article in this this first issue, so they might be covering it next week. So as we approach the 10 o'clock hour, I know that I think it was Paula that said something about we might have to extend the read along, given all the great topics and the conversation, particularly if we want to cover all the great work that you're doing, Walter. But we do try and keep the read along to an hour and a half. Particularly when we have a guest and when we have an audience, a loyal audience that is staying with us. I know other people have other things to do on Sunday morning, and you've sacrificed your morning. So again, I want to thank you for that. One of the things that we always do, we end with the magazine. So I will, with the poem in the magazine. So I want to make sure that we get to that. And also, we covered a lot of the topics that I had wanted to in terms of talking about Dr. King's legacy, the 1619 Project, and the legacy of slavery, the Black Panther work, Afrofuturism. We even got in a couple of plugs for your books, so I think that certainly is a good morning. So let's go ahead and find the poem. But before I do that, so this is one of the things I wanted to point out about the magazine. And unfortunately, I can't demonstrate this while I'm doing the live stream with my phone. I didn't want to take my wife's phone away from her this morning. But on the inside cover, there's a new feature that I hadn't noticed before. Right there, go beyond the page. This is encouraging people to use Google Lens on the cover story. So let's see. Now you can find additional content by pointing your smartphone camera at the cover and inside pages of the magazine and using Google Lens. Go behind the cover in our video series exploring the design process for every cover. Digitally save and share articles as you're reading them in print, and explore additional digital elements for select articles. To me, this is, again, one of those fascinating things about not just the Times, but the print edition. You're not going to see this if you're just looking at the article online. And so I'm looking forward to testing that out and seeing what we can learn. And they give some good instructions in terms of downloading the Google app and using Google Lens. So I encourage folks to try that out. And if you do, let me know what you see and what your experience is with that. Taking a look at some of the comments, we have a thank you from Lindsay Portnoy. So I know she was one of the colleagues that you'd want to connect with and make sure she knew about the show. Brilliant talk this morning. Looking forward to learning more. Grateful for your insights. We're grateful as well, Lindsay. And Paula is sharing a comment. Very humble. Dr. Greason has more knowledge about this topic in his little finger than I ever will, but this is what I wrote as I tried to come to terms with white privilege. Paula, thank you for sharing that. Paula writes several articles on her website, Big Green Pen, and also works for Smart Brief as an editor. Sheila is sharing that this was a great conversation, and Laura is also interested in this behind the scenes content, and we'll check it out. And then another comment, terrific read along. Appreciate the kudos. So with that, let's go to the poem. Let's see if we can find it here on page 12. So one thing that we do with the poem every week is we read the poem, but as Sree likes to say, on page 12, if you're looking, Walter, a poem should be read by the author because they understand the cadence and the meaning of the words. They should never be read cold. We do that anyway as a tribute to poetry. And I will read the introduction by Naomi Shihab Nye, the Young People's Poet Laureate of the Poetry Foundation and the New York Times poetry editor. There are still places in this world, possibly many of them, where people are not always heading somewhere else. John Brandy's delicious poems in the Great Unrest carry us around the globe to visit them. This poem brings us to the far north in conversation. His traveling meditational poems are studded by journal entries inscribed around intricate drawings. One says, "Remember when getting somewhere was important." So here is Return to Nushagak by John Brandy. Wondering if I should look up Freddie. He was pretty old when I met him. Or wondering if I should look up Freddie. He was pretty old when I met him all those years ago. He could have. So I go down to the river where he used to mend his nets, and two Yupik guys repairing an outboard motor. When I ask, is Freddie still around? Tip back their caps and smile, looking off toward the sea, putting the question back to me as one would, having grown up in a village where no one leaves. Freddie? Still around? Well, where would he go? Which is a great poem and a great idea. I know that I often think about that myself when I'm thinking about people I haven't been in touch with in a while. So let's go ahead and let's see if I can
flip the cameras again and make sure that we're good audio-wise and not getting feedback. That's always just a little bit of a trick. So we're going to go again and close this out. Thank you again, Walter, for joining us. Diana wishes we had more time. I certainly wish we had more time. Fascinating discussion, some great topics that we covered. I certainly encourage people to follow Walter on social media. Let's see if we can find, there we go. His channels, you can find him on Facebook, on Twitter, and LinkedIn. Definitely want to give a shout out to Paula Kiger and Steve Taylor for doing such a great job helping with the show, our production team today. And I was honored, as always, to be the guest host when Sree is not available. This is Shree's show, and it means a lot that he trusts me with it on a regular basis. Before we go, let's see what additional comments. that have come in. Some great comments. Let's see here. Paula is saying, we all wish we had more time. Rose commenting on the poem. Where would you go? What a great line. Chitachi, such a great conversation. Thank you. Lauren Arati offers a thank you. Sunny Slaughter, an absolutely amazing read along, and offers her thanks as well. Jonathan Borstein, our regular viewer, fascinating. Ron Thomas, thanking us. And Shago Perkins, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And Lindsay saying, great week, we're hosting. This is a new show for me, but I'll definitely be back. So thank you, Lindsay. We appreciate that. We always appreciate when we can bring in new audience members based on our guest, based on the topics that we're covering. So look forward to you joining us next week. Rose Horowitz as well, who has done some great work on Twitter with the hashtag Women to Follow. So certainly, and Walter is nodding his head, familiar with that work. Rose, thank you for your work on that, and Stacy Kratz as well for curating that list. And we have Susanna Spears going to be watching on replay. And that's one of the things I forgot to do at the very beginning of the show, is to acknowledge that a number of people watch the show on replay. It's still, they get the experience, they can see the comments, they can add their comments. If they tag Walter, I'm sure that he'll respond, and I'll be looking as well. Laura is saying she has to go back to the beginning to watch some of it. So with that, and Lindsay was talking about joining the show next week. I wanted.
Did you still want the pro tip?
Say it again.
Did you still want the pro tip?
Yes, let's talk about a pro tip. So let's talk about that connection. We'll go a little bit over 10 o'clock. Our friend Carla Baranakis, who is a former guest on the show, used to work at the New York Times, does a newsletter through Montclair. I want to say Montclair State College, Local Connection. And we're coordinating with her to include information about the read-along in each of the newsletters and a pro tip from our guests. So Walter is going to offer his pro tip now, and we'll be able to insert that in tomorrow's newsletter. Walter, it's on you.
Contain your email. Only reply once or twice a day to the bundle of emails you have to do that day. If you can always kind of control and not constantly reply to email, you find you have so much more time. Manage
email. Control your email. Walter, that's great. And Carla is thanking you for the pro tip. She's going to write that down and put that in the newsletter. In reference to next week, I want to give people a heads up on what we're going to see, which I think is going to be a fascinating show. We have, and I'll take Carla's thank you off. So next week, January 26th, our guest is going to be Virginia Walden Ford, The Real Life Miss Virginia. This is a movie that you can find online. You can purchase it, I guess, from various services. Some big name actors. She actually advocated for her son in the school system in DC. And we'll just take a look at that movie real quick in terms of the website. Miss Virginia movie. Let's see what that looks like with the background. Give me one moment. There we go. Let's take that off. So the Miss Virginia movie, here's the description. Based on a true story, Miss Virginia stars Emmy winner Uzo Aduba as a struggling single mother who is losing her 15-year-old son to the rough streets of Washington, D.C. A little bit more about Virginia Walden Ford. The movie is inspired by her story. She grew up in the Deep South her world changed when the Supreme Court decided the landmark case Brown v. Board of Education. 3 years after the decision, in 57, the Little Rock Nine enrolled at Little Rock Central High School. And in 66, Virginia and her twin sister joined about 100 other Black teens at Little Rock Central. She begged her father to let her return to her all-Black school, but he insisted she stay. So an incredible story and incredible person. She's doing some great work even today. So we're looking forward to that show. Hopefully you'll be able to join us, Walter, and others will join us next week as well. With that, I'm going to close today's show. Thank you for your time, Walter. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Hopefully you'll be able to join us next week. I think your pro tip definitely got some good feedback, excellent advice. Control your email is brilliant. Mark Lee thought it was good. And Lindsay just found 5 more hours in her day. So, there's some instant feedback on your pro tip, Walter.
It's a joy. Thank you so much. Your community, this community is spectacular.
Well, thank you. And it definitely is a pleasure to have you and a pleasure to be able to interact with you on social media. So thank you for everything you do. And we'll call this today's show. Bye, everyone.